This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This is part 2 of our series on continuity and change. The first part being really just a preview, and this is the first part with real content of how do things change and stay the same all at once. And today we will be beginning our content with the primeval history in Genesis 1 to 11. And this series is on continuity and change, though today I won't be able to talk about change with remembering that our fundamental question throughout this series on continuity and change in the Old Testament is always going to be asking that question, is this a new way of being religious? Well, here we are in Genesis 1 to 11, so I won't be able to talk about change because this is the first one with content, and so therefore nothing yet has changed. This is going to be kind of the ground floor from which we're going to see how different things will become as we move forward. So today becomes our baseline. So in Genesis 1 to 11, we of course famously have Genesis chapter 1, which has the creation story. Now, there's a lot you could talk about with creation story, but what I want to emphasize is what the text emphasizes is a structure of order, an order rather than disorder. Genesis 2 to 3 also has a creation story, but it's not nearly as obvious that this is structured around something ordered and something planned. That when in Genesis 1, in the way it's structured with day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there is a very clear plan that God is enacting in this act of creation. There's all kinds of other elements going on here. This is wildly controversial, but at least we could understand that aspect. And this is also speaking to a culture who did not generally, if we look at the Babylonian and Canaanite myths that we do have, did not think of creation that way. They thought of it as this very wild drama, where the one thing we would not have called it was some sort of divine plan in order to have creation. Instead, in the Bible, it starts with a structure that this is about order, this is about God's providence, that there is a plan. In the whole of Genesis 1 to 11, the whole primeval history is what we call that period, is really about this question of order and its slipping into disorder. And we are going to see, as soon as it's structured, in Genesis chapter 3, often called the fall into sin, the emphasis is on what is the greatest disorder that will disrupt the order God has created, and that is going to be death. Throughout Genesis 1 to 11, death is the question that continues to come up, which challenges the order God is creating. So in Genesis 3, the consequence of this sinfulness and leaving the garden is it introduces the concept of death. Then immediately following in Genesis 4, we have the famous story of Cain and Abel, which is often described as the story of the first murder. And it is the first murder, but it's even more profound than that, in that it's the first death of any kind. It is the thing that disrupts the order God has planned, is death. Further, we see, then, moving on in Genesis 6, we have this wild story of the so-called Nephilim. We don't really know what these things are. The word, that's just a transliteration of the Hebrew word. But what we discover is that it says the sons of God are sleeping with the daughters of humans, And the product are these things called Nephilim. And whatever that is, it's challenging this order. The challenge of who God is and who humans are, we seem to have as being broken. The result of that breaking is the flood, which again is structured around this question of death. What I do want to point out before we continue with this thing about death and this thing about order is that there is a structure for how God relates with people. God relates with humans. Now that's always God is relating with humans. What else is God relating with? But God is relating with humans, and actually in this portion of the Bible, also other animals. But what is different is that very frequently in the Old Testament, God relates to some humans, but not others. Well, not in this primeval history. In the primeval history, God works directly with every last human we know about. We don't have the idea that there is a special place, that there is an exemplar, that there is anything going on. It's God's working directly with all humans and frankly also all life. Animals are specifically mentioned in Genesis 1. You have plants being discussed, but simply God working directly. That is what leads to this issue of death more directly. That if God's working directly with people and they're dying, what does that mean? What crisis is that presenting, and how are you still positing order? Well, what we also have is after this flood narrative, we have the introduction of a new concept. Covenant. The first covenant, the covenant with Noah. And there's a whole variety of things that could be said about that, but that covenant is structured that it will be about, once again, the question of death. That God will not destroy all living things. That life will, in fact, be persistent, and death will not have the final say. We also have in the same theme with this death, we have in this the emphasis on these long lives of people. People living like huge numbers of years, in the hundreds, and you have even in the 900s years old before they die. Again, this issue of death as contrasted with God's order. Then this leads to its final conclusion, which is the scene at the Tower of Babel, where the people, the humans going on, are trying to build a tower high enough that they could scratch through the firmament and reach God, and break forever the order and instead find disorder. That is the final challenge that you have in the primeval history. This is a very different kind of way of being religious than we have in most of the rest of the Old Testament. Next week, we will begin the story of Abraham, and you'll be thinking about what are the ways in which God relates with Abraham that is different from this. And it's already in the same book in Genesis, but we there have a new way of being religious. So please look forward to that. For now, this is Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.